Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters. I'm super delighted to have John Llewellyn here with us today to talk about geoeconomics, geopolitics, the state of the world. I don't think we can have a better informed person to have this conversation with. John runs a firm in London. It's called Independent Economics. You can go to independent-economics.com and find out about his firm. His firm is focused on consulting for primarily corporations. I'm not sure how much government work you do, but he does it with on macroeconomic issues. But macroeconomics, as he'll explain, is a very large, encompassing, growing field because there's so many issues at play, including military issues that come into how to think about the likely prognosis for different countries in terms of their economic performances and their policy and policy adjustments in light of shocks that they might experience, what kind of shocks they might experience. So we're going to have a very wide-ranging conversation about the economy as it is now and as it may be the global economy in short order. This includes whether we're headed to another 1929 or 2008 in terms of the stock market crashing and that having repercussions for the financial system potentially melting down. Some well-respected voices are raising this concern given the valuation of the stock market, given the concentration of the valuation of the stock market, the US market, in any case, in 10 AI firms who are comprising collectively a third of the stock market, or 35%, and none of them is making any money. And they're competing like crazy, and it's not clear exactly how they can make money. But John is in a unique position to address that particular issue, because during the run up to the 2008 global financial crisis and the aftermath, well, I guess not. I'm not sure how long you stayed after this event, but John was the global chief economist and then he became senior economic policy advisor at Lehman Brothers. So we're talking with the chief economist of Lehman Brothers at the time that Lehman Brothers proceeding and at the time that Lehman Brothers failed. So that's why I said that he's really uniquely qualified to discuss whether we're heading in the same direction as we were in 2008. So John worked for Lehman Brothers for a number of years, but he has a very extensive BD here. After he left Lehman Brothers, he set up his firm in London, independent-economics.com. And let me just tell you a little bit about his background, and he'll fill in. He worked for almost 20 years at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. He was the head of international forecasting and policy analysis and editor of the OECD Economic Outlook. He's also deputy director for social affairs, manpower, and education, and finally chef to cabinet to the secretary general. So John had a really illustrious career with the OECD, and the OECD is an organization that not too many people, apart from economists, really know about, but it's a very important organization of the advanced economies around the world. They get together, they discuss policy, demographics, all kinds of issues. They help coordinate economic policymaking, and they also look ahead to what's coming. And John was really a major player for years there. A part of that, he was a professor at Cambridge University and a fellow of economics, professor of economics there, and also a fellow of St. John's College. John is a Kiwi. He's from New Zealand. He has an undergraduate degree from Victoria University of Wellington, and then he got his doctorate in economics at at Oxford University. He's widely published and widely respected. And John, it's a great pleasure and thrill to have you on. Tell us
Well,
about
thank you,
what I
Larry.
missed in this intro.
Thank you for having me
And
on.
yeah, tell us about your firm to start with, the kinds of things you cover, and then I want to mention that you have a weekly meeting with your 22 global associates who are literally located all around the world, and it starts around 6:30 a.m. Eastern, but in different parts of the world, it's different times. So people do get up early. I've gotten up a few times early to get to not as many times as I'd like to participate. And the conversation is extremely interesting. Somebody leads it and they talk about a particular issue. Like I think you said this morning, you were discussing the potential. I had to make a different meeting early, but I think you told me that you were discussing the potential for the US stock market to melt down in the near term with this group of 22 global experts. But tell us about the firm and how these experts interact with the firm.
Thank you, Larry. Yes, when we set the firm up, which was in 2008 after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, because I left Lehman Brothers, a few weeks after it collapsed. When we set it up, we were really positioned ourselves as advisors on macroeconomics in the sense in which we've always known that word. In other words, what central banks do and are going to do and what the consequences will be, and likewise for finance ministries, and likewise major economic policy initiatives and so on. And I think that's what economic advice consisted of still in many ways in those days. We had a client, for example, he described himself as a medium-sized, medium successful hedge fund. And what he used to say was, John, I'm not a great economist, but I've done economics and I understand basic economics. And I run my hedge fund by trying to guess better than the market does what the central banks are going to do. And I get it right a bit more often than I get it wrong. And so that's why I've been a medium successful hedge fund, you see. But then he closed his fund. And he closed his fund because he said, John, I don't understand the world anymore because politics has become so much more important. And that was a salutary point that he was making. And so we expanded our activities to take more explicit account of politics in economic policy formation. And then, of course, no sooner had we done that than the world broadened again. And you really now today have to take geopolitics into account as well, because they can really move markets. And so that's why we now work with a group of, as you said, 22 associates. They're all senior people. They've all been in high office in one job or another. They all are looking more for stimulus than for anything else. And that's why we, amongst other things, run that once a week video call for ourselves, which you mentioned, where we take a topic that's of concern. Somebody introduces it, doesn't talk for too long, and then everybody has a go at it. And I must say, I go into every one of those meetings thinking, I think I know what's going to be said here. By the time it's finished, I realize I didn't.
So tell me what you heard today about the potential for a crash in the market and its repercussions.
Well, the conversation was introduced by Gerald Holtham, who is an ex-academic. He was once at the OECD. He was at Brookings for a period in the United States. And then he became a CIO of Morley, the big British insurance company. And so he's both academic and a practitioner, if you like. And he pointed out that there are really three views about the markets. There's the view that the economists are getting it wrong and the Trumpists are getting it right. And obviously that's favored by the administration. The second one, which is opponents of Trump and market bears who say the market's in a bubble and it'll crash. And then the third one is, which is probably the majority view, says Trump's policies may not be very good, but the market's driven by the prospect of strong growth, mainly as a result of the huge investment in AI, and so that AI investment is overcoming, is trumping Trump, if you like. So those are the three views. Now, I wouldn't say we necessarily formed a consensus, but I'd say three views came out. The first was that, with the exception of Nvidia, which really does look extraordinarily overvalued, but if you take the next ones, I'm just looking at my screen here: Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, and Tesla. If you look at all of those, they look richly valued. But if you make assumptions about plausible growth and a plausible discount rate, and you assume the growth can go on for 10 or 15 years, they don't look absurdly valued. That was the first point. So risk, but not where you just say this is so lunatic, it's bound to happen. The second point that came out of it, which was quite different and shows you the importance of not just looking at the economics. Another of our associates, John Nucci, made the point that with these companies getting bigger and growing faster than the market, they'll represent more than 1% of GDP now, and they'll represent more than 2% of GDP in 2 years' time. And that's an enormous contribution of wealth, and also probably accompanied by an enormous culling of labor in some parts as a result of AI. And so he was making the point that this could lead to social and political problems, which would then repercuss on the economic performance, which I think was a very powerful point indeed. And so when it comes to the investment implications, the third and last conclusion was, even if you're not sure that these stocks are hideously overvalued, or the stock market as a whole is seriously overvalued, this is probably a time to lighten up a bit and take a bit of risk off the table, because nobody ever lost money by losing 10% off the top.
Exactly. So do you see any analogies between this period and 2008? We had back then lots of opacity. People were talking about private equity and investments, that somehow banks are indirectly, that this is now the shadow banking sector of the day, and that banks are indirectly investing in these companies and could end up, and some of these companies are financing themselves with cryptocurrencies, that, or investing in crypto, making investments and getting promises to be repaid in cryptocurrencies, and then they owe the banks money, and if the cryptocurrency fails, then or drops in value dramatically. And we have, I think, 20,000 cryptocurrencies. Nothing is stabilizing their relative values, that we could see something akin to 2008. Let me just say in general, you and I started talking, I think, right after Lehman Brothers failed. I'm not quite sure how we got in touch. I forget. Maybe you remember. But
You were invited to speak to the British Treasury, and I came to meet you at the airport.
oh, okay, that was it. Okay, yeah. Let's talk about retirement for a minute. It's something Americans think about regularly. Ask yourself, how financially secure do you really feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is really enough? And if you don't have enough money, how can you possibly find that extra money before you do retire? These are all tough questions. My retirement software, Maxify Planner, is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. It weighs your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life based on when you decide to retire. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. It's accurate, easy to use, and produces what you really seek, peace of mind. So make the smart choice and visit Maxify.com today. Don't miss this opportunity. That's Maxify with an I, M-A-X-I-F-I, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. This is about my limited purpose banking proposal,
Yes.
and which I'm just proposing now for Argentina, by the way. It was just down there. Yeah, and that's a very interesting economy at this point, and they have, I think, the combination of dollarization and limited purpose banking and a fundamental pension reform could just transform that country dramatically. Maybe if we have time, we can talk about that. But if I go back to 2008, the story of the day was that we had just a range of problems in the financial market that comprised unsustainable rise in housing prices. I'm just looking at an article I wrote called The Big Con that's at kotlikoff.net, of obscure, opaque financial instruments, widespread reports of egregious and predatory lending practices, dramatic increases in household mortgage debt, and exponential growth in financial firms' trading activities, unregulated derivatives and short-term repo lending markets. And yet there were pervasive permissiveness was the term used. Little meaningful action was taken to quell the threats in a timely manner. All these words are coming from the 2009 report of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the FCIC, which was set up in 2009 to explain what happened in the Great Recession. There was a comparable commission called the Victoria Commission set up in around 1936 or so to discuss or understand the causes of the Great Depression. Now, in my article, The Big Con, I point out that none of these allegations of what caused the Great Recession are actually true in terms of looking at the data. All the things that were contended by the FCIC, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, are just not fact-based. There wasn't an unsustainable rise in housing prices. There wasn't a dramatic increase in leverage of the banks that did get into trouble and the other financial institutions. A lot of the subprimes were too small, I argue, to have mattered to the mortgage market, which was itself too small to matter to the U.S. financial market, which was itself too small to matter to the global financial market. That these derivatives that were supposed to be poorly rated ended up doing quite well, even though they had to go through these subprime mortgages, no doc, ninja loans, supposedly the worst of the worst, did quite well. So I'm just wondering whether the argument of this paper, The Big Con, is that what we have is a financial system that's subject to what we economists call multiple equilibria, where if there's sufficient belief that the financial market's going to collapse, people will take actions to make that happen. So self-fulfilling prophecy was the term that Robert K. Merton, Bob Merton's dad, came up with. Do you see that possibility here today?
Certainly a possibility, Larry. I think in addressing your question, and if I may say, I think you're absolutely right to focus on 2008 as the pivotal example. But just before I get to answer that, if I may, it seems to me that today we're facing two issues at the same time. We've got a technological revolution in AI on the one hand, and then we've got the possibility of financial excess on the other. And so we've got those two things coalescing potentially. Now, if I just spend a few seconds on the technological revolution, in the past, they've been rather slow in their effects on the economy. I mean, the railways took 100 years, the steam engine took a long time, electricity was a bit quicker, but it's possible that AI is different because it's very quick. I mean, we've all got AI on our phones and on our computers now. So it's at least different in that it's quicker. And it's also different because it probably affects all parts of the economy simultaneously. Just about everywhere is affected by it. So we've got that component. And then there's the financial risk that you point to, which is, are we in the same situation or potentially in the same situation as 2008? And you're obviously right to focus on that because that was the really huge shock, that collapse of Lehman Brothers and the other associated companies. And of course, it was tightly associated with leverage. And if you read Kindleberger's book on manias, panics, and crashes, for example, he tells you that leverage is a killer. And he's right. Of course, he's a killer. The difficulty, though, is that you don't know how much leverage there really is in the system. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that I was on the trading floor at Lehman's all the way through that process, right up until the end. And you could tell that there was huge money being made. I mean, that was true of Lehman Brothers, and it was true of all of the other investment banks. They were all making money hand over fist. And if they were making rates of return on equity in double digits, when the economy as a whole has had productivity growth of, I don't know, 1 or 2 or 3%, that either the sector's unique or somebody's taking a lot of risk. And in fact, it was that people were taking a very great deal of leveraged risk. But the numbers weren't there to tell anybody what what the magnitude was. In fact, they didn't even understand the mechanism in many ways, because these subprime mortgages added up to a risk which really nobody quite put their finger on. It's the Warren Buffett phenomenon that you don't know who's bathing naked until the tide goes out. And I do fear that the same is true this time, that we know there's leverage in the system. We know that private equity, for example, has become a huge player in various areas, including practically the whole of the insurance industry. There's stable coins, as you say, which is a completely new phenomenon. But actually working out what the risk is that's involved is almost instrument by instrument. And the data normally aren't there to enable people to do that. So you get the worries that you've expressed, and that I certainly share, but actually nailing it, that's another matter.
Tell us a bit about the days leading up to Lehman's bankruptcy. Was it clear to you as the chief economist in the year before? I mean, was the opacity right there at Lehman where nobody knew, perhaps even Dick Fold, who was the president or the CEO, knew what the situation was? It's just knife edge that nobody kind of, it wasn't over until it was over, so to speak. It could always have been bailed out at the last second. And
Well, I can tell you a couple of stories which I think illustrate, but let me preface them by saying I don't want to pretend that I saw it coming definitively. I'm not one of those people who's going to rewrite history. I didn't, but I'll tell you these stories and you can make of them what you will. I was on the trading floor one day, and as I say, it felt like a feeding frenzy. People were making huge amounts of money. They were starting to think about what this might mean for their bonuses at the end of the year, and so on and so forth. You could talk to individuals about the particular type of business they were in, and you could understand it, but you couldn't easily add it all up. But all I can say is it felt dangerous, mainly because it had never felt like that before, I think. But if you said to me, what exactly are you worried about? I wouldn't know. But one day with me, it bubbled over, and I spoke to the head fixed income trader, and I said, this feels dangerous to me. I think we're heading for something disastrous. And he looked at me and he said, well, what do you think is going to happen? I said, I don't know. He said, when do you think it's going to happen? I said, I don't know. He said, well, come back when you do. And he turned on his heel. He was a rude guy. That made me cross. So I crossed the trading floor and I went into the office without even knocking of the global CIO, Chief Investment Officer. And I said, Roger, I'm really worried. I think, and I piled rhetoric on rhetoric. I said, I really think we're heading for a disaster, something like the 1930s. And he said, John, sit down, sit down. And I sat down. He said, John, you know I've got great respect for you, and you don't normally come into my room without knocking, and you don't normally come in so agitated. So let me assure you, I am listening to you. And so I told him what it felt like. And he said, well, speak to the chief trader. And I said, I did. And he brushed me off. And he said, well, John, I hear you. And I will go upstairs and I will suggest that I'm not going to suggest that we take any risk off, because if I do that, our returns will go down and they'll go down relative to our competitors. And then our shareholders will say, how come you're earning less than we are? He said, I can't do that. Without giving them chapter and verse, I can't do it. But he said, I will take steps to make sure that we can go more liquid quickly than would have been the case. So that's my first story. And I went home to my,
What date was that? Was this?
it would have been early in 2008,
Okay, and Lehman fails in September.
September.
15th. Yeah.
So I went home to my wife and I said, I think I've earned my money today because I think I've made Lehman's a slightly safer place. And then the next day, I went to the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, which, as you know, is the central banker's central bank, to a meeting which was held by their chief economist, Bill White, and he invited a dozen or so chief economists from Europe and the US and Japan to discuss risk before they produced their annual end of year risk assessment. So we had a good discussion all day, and then we went to dinner. And at the dinner, I was sitting, as it happened, next to Bill White. And I told him this story about what I'd done. And as I finished telling him, I was conscious that the table had gone silent. One of those occasions when just by chance everybody stops talking at the same time. So everybody was listening, and I felt slightly embarrassed. And I said, "Oh dear, Bill, I'm sorry. Have I farted in church? You see?" And he said, "No, that's interesting." And then sitting on my left was the chief economist of HSBC, and he said, "John, I have had exactly the same discussion in my bank. That I'm worried. I don't really know what form my worry takes, but what they've said is they'll make sure they can go liquid more quickly than they would have done if they hadn't had my warning." And then we went round the table and everybody said the same thing. So I then got really scared because I thought, here you've got all the chief economists. They all are worried. They've all alerted their top management. Their top management have all said, fine, but we can't take any risk off, but we will take steps to go more liquid. And then, of course, Bill White summed it up brilliantly because he said, if everybody's ready to go liquid at the first sign of trouble, there'll be when the fire bell rings, there'll be a rush for the exit and everybody will get stuck in it. And that's exactly what happened, of course. So I don't want to pretend, and I think there's a lesson in this. I don't think you can analyze this thing with hard numbers that are good enough to convince risk takers that they're facing systemic risk, even though they probably are. But you do have to trust your feeling, your instinct, your experience, or against history or something like that. Now, I'm told, and I'm no longer on the trading floor, I'm told that it's not as frenetic on the trading floor today as it was. But then again, trading's much more quiet now. It's done all on computers, so you won't see the leverage, even indirectly, by body language.
Right. Now, two interesting things come up here. One is that you were not talking directly to Dick Fold, and I presume these other chief
I was because I would open the every morning. He had two risk meetings, one at 9 o'clock and one at 10 o'clock. The 9 o'clock one was economics and politics, and then the 10 o'clock was market risk. And I used to open the first one. So yeah, I was talking to him.
And what was your impression of him? I mean, I think it's been reported that he had, maybe it was Bear Stearns, I'm not sure which bank it was, that he had packed the board with yes people, and that he wasn't getting much independent advice, and that he had a degree of arrogance that couldn't be impacted or couldn't get him to change his mind. But again, I might be getting mixed up with the head of Bear Stearns. It's been a while, but the question is whether he had any more knowledge than you, and whether he shared your concerns, and whether what he said in testimony to Congress after Lehman failed was that what happened to Lehman could have happened to any other bank and would have happened to Goldman and Morgan Stanley, the other two large surviving institutions, had the TARP bill not been passed, that this was just utter and sheer panic and banks running on banks in effect, rather than the households running in banks when we had 900 banks or so, or 9,000 banks in the 30s, a third of the banks failing. What's your take on Unfold? I kind of think he got a tough, personally, I think he got a bad rap in all this, but maybe I thought what he said in Congress was exactly right, that we have a system that's fundamentally unstable. It's built to fail. It's built on trust. It's opaque. There's never been, we have the key problem is leverage and opacity have never been addressed. They weren't addressed in Dodd-Frank. They weren't addressed in the British reform by, I remember the Vickers report. And that until these problems are fundamentally fixed with a whole different financial structure, we're not going to get out from under this historic problem of financial collapse, which, about a third or so of U.S. recessions have the name panic or crisis of in their titles. And then others are just, we'll call recession of blah, will have some triggering event that has nothing to do with bringing down the entire economy, like Jay Gould goes broke, some important financier that shouldn't bring down the entire economy, but it does. And that smacks to me of mobile equilibria.
I think that's broadly right, Larry, actually, in the following sense that, first of all, I mean, Lehman's probably had some bad investments, one in particular in California, but it was doing the same thing as other banks were doing. Which is that they were taking these subprime mortgages, they were aggregating them into big lots. The idea was that they would then cut these into tranches and sell the different tranches at different prices and distribute them. And if you remember, at the time, Greenspan was very happy with that, on the perfectly logical argument that if this risk was being dispersed widely throughout the economy, then if one bit of it went sour, it didn't affect any big players too much. It was widely spread. But of course, as we know, that risk, that aggregate and distribute model subtly changed and then fundamentally changed to aggregate and hold. And so the banks then kept it on their balance sheets and then raised money from the commercial banks against that asset. And the rating agencies connived in this by giving them high ratings. And so you had a system which, as you say, was really set up to fail by that point. Once it became originate and hold, and once you had the rating agencies giving these things AAA ratings, which subtly gave the impression that they were of the same degree of risk as sovereign bonds, which was absurd. Well,
Yeah,
it was set up to fail, yes.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
If you take a look at this piece, The Big Con, at kotlikoff.net under articles, there was a study by I think a couple of Chicago economists I cite. It's been a couple of years now since I wrote this piece. They looked at 10,000 mortgages and the rating of them, and came back with a conclusion that the rating was not off base. That this was actually, the rating was fine. That these people were not on the take and misrating. If you think about the the Maiden Lane Fund that was supposed to be the worst of the worst subprimes that Bear Stearns sold to the Federal Reserve, presumably at an overly high price, in order to have the Federal Reserve induce JP Morgan to buy Bear Stearns at $2 a share when 2 months before it sold at 190 a share. Well, that Maiden Lane Fund, which was supposed to be Maiden Lane is the rear end of the Federal Reserve. It's the street behind the Federal Reserve, the back of the Federal Reserve. So it was really an inside joke about the excrement of the Federal Reserve. They had purchased shit. And then this fund actually turned out to have made a profit, having gone through the Great Recession. People just didn't default to the extent that was expected. And Tim Geithner, who was the Treasury Secretary during much of this period, was crowing about that fact, that and not really putting the two and two together here, which is that it wasn't the subprimes. He was right. It wasn't the subprimes were better than people thought, but it was the belief about the subprimes that
That's right. That's right.
And now we have belief. Let me talk to you about technology, and then we're going to talk about some other things like Ukraine and China. But when I look at AI, I can see it does certain things fantastically. I'm certainly using it to help make myself more efficient. It's probably raised my productivity 10%, to tell you the truth, in terms of being how fast I can produce articles and so forth. But
Yep.
there's two things that come to mind. One is that if it can, let's say, outmode or replace, redundify, let's say 40% of the workforce, and we're not just talking about low skill, but also middle skill, white collar workers, then there's a question about who's going to have the money to buy what it is that AI produces. So there's that question. And I talked about that with two co-authors in a paper called Robots Are Us. The idea being that we produce this AI, we let's say computer scientists or AI experts, and they develop it, and then it becomes embedded in technology, and then you don't need more computer scientists to write more AI code. It can write itself, and then you put these people out of jobs. We saw that in the dot-com bubble, that right after the dot-com bubble, there was a big surplus of computer coders, and people couldn't get jobs in that field. And we're seeing some layoffs among computer engineers at this point, software engineers. So one question is here whether we have, in this paper, you get the potential for immiserating growth. You have a technological boom, short run, and then it's like a Kondratiev cycle. He's the Russian economist, famous, where there's a technological change that produces a boom, but then a bust. And in our long run, the economy ends up impoverished relative to where it was initially. The whole thing makes everybody worse off because there's actually less capital. People will have less wages. They can't save as much more better technology, but less physical stuff, capital to actually produce output, and also less demand for the output. So kind of demand destroys supply, as opposed to supply creates its own demand, which is Say's law. So there's that thing I wanted to put into your head. And then the other question, or raised with you, but then the other question is whether these AI companies are going to compete each other to death and produce and when people realize that there's not much money to be made because there's so many, they're basically involved in disseminating information, which is a public good. And you can think about them potentially reading each other's results. One LLM can query another LLM. Maybe it has to be done under the rug or whatever. But in the end, they could all be providing the same answers. There's already 40 of these LLMs out there. Why would anybody pay much for these things? I don't see it, and why. And then the advertising could also go to hell that's connected with these production of these companies. That I think they're relying on that because the LLMs aren't going to be trained to advertise. They're going to be trained to tell the truth about what product's the best, right? So why would I, if I've got a second-rate product, want to put out more information for the LMs to evaluate and then discard? I'm not quite sure where the profit model is here in these companies.
No, that's it. Those are two very good questions, if I may say. We've discussed them both in our group. I mean, to respond to those two questions, the first one, if AI does what we increasingly think it will do, which is to displace quite a number of workers and in the process empower the people who use it. So, in other words, there'll be the more senior ranks, not the top ranks, but more senior ranks of white collar workers will use it and become more productive, but will displace some lower rank people who before would have done all sorts of research for them. If that's the first stage, then I think what matters crucially is what happens to those people who are displaced, as you said. And there are obviously in the limit two possibilities. I mean, one is that they can't do anything else, then they can never do anything else, and they become dog walkers. The other is that they retrain or reskill, because in our societies, there are some areas in which the demand for services is very highly elastic with respect to income, of which health services are one and social services in an aging population are another. So I think if you look across countries, it doesn't follow that all countries are going to do equally well. I would say, for example, that the Scandinavian countries, who are very big on retraining and reskilling, and it's one of the things that they use their tax revenue for, will probably be quite successful at that. Some European countries will be and some won't. And the UK, US, as is always the case with the US, will be patchy. Some parts will do well and some won't. But that'll be the issue. How well what do the people who are displaced become? Dog walkers or health workers, to put it in that simple case.
But even at this point, primary care physicians in the US make a lot less or not much more than a plumber does on a lifetime basis. So, which is a kind of a moderate, lower middle class salary, unless we have redistribution, much more effective fiscal policy, we're not going to. I think, Sweden, you have people willingly paying taxes because there's lots of public goods and there's lots of concern for other people. In our country, we have a melting pot that hasn't melted. We have people that are out for themselves. Older people in Florida don't vote for paying for new schools because they're in it for themselves. And
the US won't adjust in the Swedish way, you're quite right. It'll adjust in the market way, of course, and that is that the sectors in which demand is strong and supply is weak, salaries will rise and people will tend to move into those. But it's a more brutal process. But
yeah, I just see, increasing inequality. And we already have
yes,
Elon Musk having more wealth than 52% of the fellow Americans in the, his more wealth by himself than more than half of the American public. That's
right. That, as I say, in our associates discussion, was brought out very clearly that the inequalities that are increasing in the world. This wasn't that these people were particularly socialist. They weren't objecting to inequalities on moral grounds. They tried to keep away from that, but they were pointing out that inequalities lead to distress and lead to violence and political upset and populism and all of that. So I think you're right to point to the inequalities because they lead to consequences. I mean, you could argue that the election of President Trump was due to inequalities to some extent because the people in the Midwest had not participated in the benefits of international trade that people on the two coasts had, for example. And that led to a very real change in leadership and in policies. And the same thing can be seen in many countries in Europe, and it's very likely going to be a tension in China as well. So yes, you're right. Inequalities matter. Not them. I mean, you can have your own moral position on that, but quite independently of that, they lead to political and social consequences. I think that's indisputable.
I'd like to talk to you about a really powerful financial planning tool to help you make smart retirement and other critical financial decisions. It's a tool that factors in all your financial data and shows you what you can sustainably spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is my software company's Maxify Planner. It's incredibly powerful, it's accurate, and it's easy to use. Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Its focus is on raising, de-risking, and sustaining your living standard. Maxify lets you run what-if scenarios to see how your finances will change in taking new jobs, buying a home, doing Roth conversions, retiring early, downsizing, investing more in the market, you name it. Knowing the impact of these decisions before you make them is the secret to making smarter decisions. And it's also the secret to what we all seek, which is financial peace of mind. So please visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I, Maxify.com, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. And how do you see AI making money, these companies making money, or how do you and your experts?
I'm not sure I do, but when we had a discussion about this, one of the points that was made was that when Google started out, Google was very long on saying we've created this search engine and we're making it free and it's for the good of humanity. But in later years, Google has proved quite good at charging for what it delivers. It found a way. Now, I can well imagine, as you say, that not all of these purveyors of large language models are going to be able to monetize it. So perhaps there'll be some pretty rough consolidation. But I would have thought they will, these are smart guys, and I would have thought they will find a way of monetizing it in due course. The fact that I can't foresee it doesn't mean it won't happen, of course.
Yeah. So let's talk about the elephants in the room, starting with Ukraine. You know, right now we have reports of Russia taking over some important villages, although they're bombed to smithereens at this point. Do you see the potential for a Russian breakthrough where they take over Ukraine, where the U.S. sits back? What do you make of the U.S. policy with respect to Ukraine? Do you think we have a president he's been described by Aslan Anders, who you know, and he's one of your 22 people that come to the meetings, as a Russian asset on this podcast. And I'm wondering, you know, we don't have information about exactly what the U.S. is doing to help Ukraine. I would hope they're doing a lot of things undercover that are positive, but we do know there's been no bill passed by Congress to give them any additional aid. And then today's FT talked about the fact that the French can't even send tanks to Romania on the roads because the roads aren't built to handle the tanks that go across from France to Romania. They have to be shipped by sea through the Mediterranean, whatever. So what do you think is happening on the ground there, and what's likely to happen, and what's the U.S. doing and not doing, and what are the Europeans doing and not doing, and what's the prognosis?
Well, I think there's several points to be made. The first is that Ukraine, the invasion by Russia, has shaken Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, to the core. Europe has enjoyed a very long period, 50 years of peace after the Second World War. It lived with the threat of the Cold War, but that was stable under assured mutual destruction. So when you actually got those troops crossing the border into Ukraine, you actually saw Russia on the march. That shook Europe politically, and I don't think you can overstate the importance of that. And if you need one demonstration of that, it's the way in which Chancellor Merz in Germany just got up and said, this has changed everything, we have to militarize, which would have been unthinkable to say if it hadn't been for a big event like Russia invading Ukraine. That's the first thing. So it has shaken Europe militarily. Second thing is, of course, President Trump has said with some justification that Europeans have been free riders on American defense. I say some justification because after the war, the Americans were very happy to provide that security guarantee because meant they could ensure a stable Europe, which they regarded as being in their interests. And you still could argue that in terms of what it costs, it's quite a good insurance policy. But you can interpret the evidence differently and say Europe were free riding, and I think they were. That is changing. Germany, again, completely changed its attitude to public debt and said we'll stick to our tight debt practices with everything else except defense. And there we're going to increase the budget deficit and we're going to spend a lot of money, several percentage points of GDP fairly quickly. And there's a lot going on under the surface. German industry is expanding. French, who have a very impressive military industry in many ways, not in every dimension, but in many ways. But a good navy, a good air force. They produce aircraft and missiles themselves. So do the British. There's a process which is underway. It also involves, as you just said a moment ago, strengthening the infrastructure so that the roads are capable of taking the transport, so you can transport the tanks and so on to the front. So, but there's a lot going on, believe me. That's one thing. Third point is that the war has changed out of all recognition in the time that it's been prosecuted. At the beginning, it was about troops, tanks, trench warfare, guns. And so the US providing tanks and HIMARS and so on was terribly important. And it checked, it didn't stop, but it checked the Russians. But the emergence of drone warfare has totally changed that. To start with, it's made it a very different form of warfare now. There's now a zone between Russia and the Ukraine, which you just can't set foot in because a drone will pick you off if you do. And whether you're on foot or in a tank, it's changed all of that. And secondly, Ukraine can produce and does produce and is producing huge quantities of sophisticated drones itself, whereas it wasn't able to produce Abrams tanks and HIMARS and things like that. So that's a massive change. Now, this doesn't mean it's not costing Ukraine. Ukraine is spending about 50% of its GDP on defense, huge. But what it means is that the aid that Ukraine now needs is financial more than materiel. And that's the fundamental change. And that has made the US potentially less necessary. Because whereas Europe couldn't provide various types of materiel that the Americans could provide, it can. I'm not saying it hasn't yet, but it can provide the money. So if it wants to, and if it's politically able to get its act together, and as you know, we're getting close to the situation of using US assets which are frozen for this purpose, then it can pay Ukraine to prosecute its own war. And therefore the US is relatively less important than it was. And indeed, in terms of the value of aid, Europe is now a significantly bigger provider than the US is. So so those are the three things which have changed.
If the Russians made a breakthrough, you don't see this possible, but if they did advance towards Kiev, would you see European countries landing troops? Engaging?
Well, who knows? But there's some pretty strong anti-Russian voices. I mean, they're strongest from Germany and Poland and the UK. And they would not want to see that happen. They really would not want to see that happen. How it would play out, well, you'd have to be a military strategist, and I'm not. But they really do not want to see it. There's a fear now of Russia and a belief that you've simply got to stop it, that the talk about let's negotiate a solution is nonsense, that he's a strong man, he's got to be met with force. And if you've got the Germans believing that, the French believing that, and the Brits believing that, that adds up to quite a lot. Now, I'm not either pretending that the US is out of this, because the US provides some crucial input still, including airborne intelligence. Airborne warfare is important, and the US provides a lot of that. It provides a lot of naval intelligence as well. So I think that the combination of political will in Europe, particularly the UK, Germany, and France, plus strategic and tactical assistance from the US when needed, has got every chance of holding the Russians now.
So you think the US is actually under maybe in a lower, with less publicity, helping more than we think, or more than Oslin at least thinks, that Trump is a little bit more balanced on this than.
Yeah, well, I can't know, of course, because you don't get told that sort of thing. But if it turned out, if the historians find out that that was the case, I, for one, would not be in the slightest bit surprised.
I got it. Trump seems to be making some headway in the Middle East in terms of this Gaza agreement that was just signed yesterday at the Security Council. That sounds like a good, hopeful sign that he certainly, for all the concerns I have with his economic policy and his rhetoric and his behavior, it seems like he is willing to shake things up. That he's the first president we've seen for maybe a century, I don't know, a very long time, maybe since Roosevelt, I guess, to say we fundamentally need to change the facts on the ground in ways that make sense, and that so I think he's not afraid to make big moves, but maybe these moves are shooting ourselves in the head to some extent. So let me bring us to a close by talking about China. Here we have, I think, 45% tariffs on China, and it's about to be Christmas time. So everything that we're going to be buying for toys for kids are going to be much more expensive. And do you see the U.S. kind of do you think Trump started just going crazy with these tariffs without thinking them through, and now he's backtracking? Is this the Trump always chickens out, the taco play, the financial play? That's what was described in the financial setting, but in the tariff setting, is that carrying over where he's saying, well, now I've got to pull back on dealing with too aggressively with China because they have a stranglehold over rare earth minerals and other vital supplies to the U.S., and we can't not work with them. And on the other hand, he's left 45% tariffs in place, and the Chinese can certainly say, well, okay, we'll send you this stuff, but it might never come, or may come with a big lag. They may say, we're going to buy soybeans from your farmers, but not buy that many, or say, well, we'll buy them at this price, but not at that price. How do you see the whole relationship? Do you think the whole thing is kind of broken down, and that as a result that there's going to be a realignment, a global economic realignment with Europe and China and other South America, really economically aligning with China because the U.S. has become too unreliable trading partner?
I think it helps here, Larry, to go back to first principles. After the Second World War, essentially the Americans, with a little bit of help from the British, but mainly the Americans, set up a system for running the world economy based on the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods, but not the free movement of labor. An adjustment system of exchange rates was made possible within the framework of the IMF, and a transfer of income between countries to some extent to keep international inequalities within limits through the World Bank. That's been a system which it hasn't worked perfectly, but it's worked really surprisingly well for about 60 years. It's not bad to design a system that lasts that long. When it broke down, it started to break down, you could argue, with Japan, which had an extremely mercantilist view about world trade. But the Americans were able to bring Japan to heel and say, you're not going to export and kill our industries. We're going to stop you. And they did. And the Japanese, in the end, responded by exporting less and investing in the US. Now China's doing that, but on a much greater scale. And what it's revealed is that the Bretton Woods system needs to have an industrial policy component to it, because it's just not politically possible for China to supply all the manufacturers to everybody in the world. Other countries are just not going to buy the consequences of this. Not the US, not Europe, not Australia, not anywhere. So the Chinese are going to have to start to learn to buy their own goods. If they've got all this terrific supply potential, why not buy them at home? And the answer is, of course, because the Chinese save a huge proportion of their income, getting on for 50%. And they do so for their old age, something you know about more than almost anybody. And they do it for their old age because there's no state pension system whatsoever. So, of course, you save for your old age. So China's left in that silly situation where it has all these savings, that it exports to keep GDP up, and then it has these financial savings which it puts into US treasuries. Now, the Trump tariffs don't really address that issue. They don't really oblige the Chinese to raise consumption. They encourage the Chinese to sell to other countries, and they're doing so. They're selling more into Asia and more into Europe and less into the US than they were. But it doesn't address the basic Chinese issue, which is that they consume too little and invest too much and export too much. While this tariff exercise by Trump is important with all the mechanisms that people talk about, it's actually a sideshow compared with the real issue. And so that takes you to your question. Even so, what's going to happen? And I think to some extent, countries like Europe, countries like the UK, countries like Australia do want to trade with China, and they're very alarmed if they're forced by the US to say, you've got to choose between us and China. But at the same time, China's not making it easy for them by all its spying activities. And only today, you've had MI5 in the UK warn parliamentarians, both houses, that there's a real threat from Chinese espionage. So the Chinese are not making it easy for other countries to realign their trade relationships with the US. So we've got an extremely unsustainable situation. And as the American economist Herb Stein said, things that can't go on forever don't. And this can't go on.
Yeah, I think what Herb should have said is that things that can't go on forever will end, but end too late. In the case of the US, we have a fiscal system that's completely out of control, and
Yes.
we're in worse fiscal shape than Italy by a mile. Paper at Kolikov.net showing our fiscal gap is twice as big as Italy's.
Right.
Yeah, what do you think about the Chinese military buildup? Is this something should we be actively engaged in some kind of a deal making between Taiwan and China? Trump wants to get the Nobel Prize. It seems like having having Taiwan lease itself to China for 100 years as the Hong Kong model, with the British leasing it from China, would make a lot of sense in this context, because a war between these two countries that have nuclear weapons, and now that China is building up its nuclear arsenal, it just seems ridiculous compared to, there's no reason that China and Taiwan can't be working together as Hong Kong and China. I mean, clearly a lot of people in Hong Kong are very upset about the dominance of the mainland in terms of their politics, and it's that they feel they've lost their freedom and freedom of expression, and and they're afraid, and they're leaving. Many of them are. So I was in Hong Kong recently. The ones that can get out, I think, are leaving. But surely there has to be a more sensible solution here. That I don't see any intrinsic reason that Taiwan and China shouldn't be united.
I tell you, the emotions in this are extraordinary. When I was a kid growing up in New Zealand, I was a shortwave radio enthusiast, and I used to listen to broadcasts from around the world. And I used to listen, amongst others, to Radio Peking, and Radio China was always, and this we're talking about the 50s and the 60s, was vitriolic about Taiwan. Vitriolic. The language was about gangsters and rogue countries and imperial running dogs and all, really tough stuff. And then if you listen to Taiwan, it was no different. Now, in the intervening years, Taiwan has had a succession of governments, and some have been more pacific and some have been more aggressive than others. But you've only got to go to Taiwan and spend a few days there to realize they do not wish to join with China at all. So the emotion between those two is extraordinarily strong. Now, of course, if one were a hugely strong imperial power, one could beat their heads together and say, come on, boys, get together, settle your differences. But there's no imperial power now that's big enough to do that to China. I mean, the US can use its best efforts, and it can say that it would make it very expensive for China to attack Taiwan, but it can't force a settlement. Personally, I think this is a status quo which is not too unstable and can go on for a long time. I don't think the Chinese would be foolish enough to attack Taiwan militarily. It's as the Germans found in the Second World War, even the narrowest strip of water makes the job enormously more difficult. And so the English have long blessed the English Channel, and I should think the Taiwanese have long blessed the narrow strip of ocean between them and mainland China. I don't think China would take it on. But then, as I say, when emotions run so strong as they do, and of course, add one more thing, we all know that when countries' leaders do badly at home, they turn outwards to foreign policy and invent or augment a foreign aggressor. And if China's economy really were to weaken, wouldn't surprise one in the slightest if the Chinese leadership were to escalate the Taiwanese just as a diversion of domestic attention. So I think it won't happen, but I'd like to be more sure than I am that I'm right.
Great. Well, listen, John, thank you so much for spending time. We will do this again, and I'm so glad to have connected with you back now about whatever X years, been a bit. And
Well, that's great, Larry, and we certainly would love to have you towards the end of the year or the beginning of the next year coming on and bringing us some of your wisdom. So thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it.
great. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.